I was on my knees, scrubbing the grout on the kitchen floor, when I heard my son, Mark, talking to his wife, Sarah, in the living room. Their voices were low, but in the quiet of a Tuesday morning, their words were sharp and clear. "She's just a housewife, Sarah. What does she know about finances?" he said. "That baking money she's so proud of won't even cover a month's rent here." A cold knot formed in my stomach. For years, I had let them believe my baking money, small profits from selling cakes and pies, was my only income. They had no idea about the modest inheritance my own mother had left me, or how for 3 decades, after they were asleep, I'd been teaching myself to navigate the stock market, turning that small seed into a formidable portfolio. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I dipped the brush back into the soapy water. The chemical smell of the cleaner filled my nose, but all I could focus on was the sting of his words. Just a housewife. It was a label I had worn with a quiet pride for 40 years. I had raised 2 children in this very apartment building, managed a household on a shoestring budget after my husband passed, and found joy in simple things: the perfect rise on a sponge cake, the gleaming reflection on a polished floor. My baking was my art, a small business that gave me purpose and pocket money. I never felt the need to tell them it was a decoy. My real work happened in the silent hours of the night, under the glow of a monitor, where I wasn't a housewife, but a trader. After they left for their high-powered jobs, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and ambition, I finished cleaning the floor. Each methodical scrub was a way to regain my composure. The conversation replayed in my mind. They weren't just dismissive, they sounded burdened. For the last 6 months, Mark had been making comments about the rising property values in the city. "You're lucky to have this place, Mom," he'd say. "An apartment this size would go for a fortune now." I had always thought he was just making conversation. Now a more sinister interpretation began to dawn on me. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, the one I'd shared with their father, while they lived in an identical unit 1 floor above. I paid my rent on time, every time, directly to the building management. But Mark and Sarah, they dream bigger. That evening, they invited me upstairs for dinner. It was a sterile affair of takeout containers and forced smiles. Sarah, ever the diplomat, started the conversation. "Martha, we've been thinking," she began, her voice smooth as silk. "This old building, it's a lot for you to manage, isn't it?" I looked around their apartment, identical to mine, but filled with sleek, modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. "I manage just fine, dear," I said politely. Mark jumped in, his tone impatient. "What Sarah is trying to say is we found a wonderful new place for you, a retirement community. It's, more suitable. It has on-site nursing and prepared meals." They were presenting it as a gift, a kindness. But I heard the subtext. They wanted me out. They saw my home not as my sanctuary, but as an underutilized asset. They saw me not as their mother, but as an obstacle. I felt a profound sadness settle in my chest, a weight heavier than any financial loss. This was a betrayal of a different kind. It was the quiet, creeping erasure of my value in their eyes. A week later, the pressure mounted. Mark started leaving brochures for Golden Meadows Senior Living on my kitchen counter. The picture showed smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard, their faces frozen in a state of manufactured joy. It felt like a threat. My home of 40 years was being reduced to an inconvenient variable in their life's equation. They thought my resistance was sentimental foolishness. They had no idea it was strategic. The true extent of their deception, however, was something I could never have anticipated. It came to light on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Mark had called me in a panic. "Mom, I need you to print out a contract for me. My printer's dead. I just emailed it to the family account." The family account was an old email address we barely used, a relic from a time when they still needed my help with their homework. I logged in, the password familiar under my fingertips. There, at the top of the inbox, was the email from his lawyer. But below it was another, a conversation thread between him and Sarah from 2 weeks prior. The subject line was simply, "The Martha Problem."
My blood ran cold. I knew I shouldn't, but my hand moved the mouse of its own accord. I clicked. The email chain laid their plan bare, and it was far crueler than simply wanting my apartment. They were in serious financial trouble. An investment Sarah had championed had gone bust, and they were deeply indebted. I scrolled through the messages, my breath catching in my throat. They had, years ago, convinced me to grant them a limited power of attorney just for medical emergencies. They had used it. Without my knowledge, they had taken out a substantial second mortgage against the value of my investment portfolio, a portfolio they weren't even supposed to know existed in detail. They had gambled with my entire life's work and lost it all. The plan now was to force me into the cheapest care facility they could find, sell my apartment's contents, and use my baking money savings to make the initial payments to their creditors until they could figure out a more permanent solution. They hadn't just disrespected me, they had committed fraud. They had plundered my security, my future, and looked me in the eye while talking about my own good. The woman who scrubbed floors and baked cakes disappeared in that moment, replaced by someone else. The quiet, methodical focus I applied to the stock market now had a new target. I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for the woman they had tried to erase. The air in the room seemed to crackle with a new energy. It was the energy of a decision being made. I saved the emails to a hidden flash drive, a piece of digital evidence that felt as solid and heavy as a block of gold. Then I calmly printed Mark's contract, placed it on the table, and went back to my own apartment. The game had changed.
Back in the sanctuary of my own apartment, the shock subsided and was replaced by a chilling clarity. The hurt was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was now fuel. I walked over to the old, unassuming oak desk in the corner of my spare bedroom. To Mark and Sarah, it was just a piece of furniture where I kept my recipes. To me, it was the headquarters of my secret life. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dim room. There, on the screen, was the fortress they thought they had breached. They had stolen the value of the second mortgage, a devastating amount, but they hadn't known the full extent of the kingdom. My portfolio, even with their theft, was still substantial. For 30 years, I had been disciplined. I lived modestly, reinvested my dividends, and made careful, calculated plays. My guiding principle was simple: never be dependent. My late husband's illness had taught me that lesson the hard way. I would never again be at the mercy of circumstances or the goodwill of others, not even my own children. I navigated to my brokerage account. The number staring back at me was a testament to 3 decades of sleepless nights and diligent research, a portfolio worth over $3.5 million. A wave of grim satisfaction washed over me. They had thought they were robbing a piggy bank. They had no idea they'd broken into a vault. My mind, accustomed to seeing patterns and opportunities in market data, began to work. Revenge was an emotional indulgence I couldn't afford. What I needed was a permanent solution: justice. I thought about the building. It was an old pre-war structure owned by a family trust that had recently decided to sell. Mark had mentioned it offhand, complaining about the possibility of a new corporate landlord. An idea, bold and terrifying, began to crystallize. It was a long shot, an aggressive move, but it was perfect. It wasn't just defense, it was a checkmate. I picked up the phone and dialed my broker, a man I had only ever spoken to, never met. His name was David, and he knew me only as Martha, his quiet, unassuming client who made surprisingly savvy trades. "David," I began, my voice steady, "I need to liquidate a significant portion of my holdings. I need 7 figures in cash by Friday." There was a pause on the other end. "Martha, is everything all right? That's a big move. Tax implications will be significant." "I'm aware,"
I replied, my voice leaving no room for argument. It's for a real estate acquisition. Another beat of silence, then a simple, understood. I'll get it done. When I hung up, the decision was sealed. I wasn't just saving my apartment, I was buying the entire building. They wanted to take my home, so I would become their landlord.
The following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after I had overheard their conversation, Mark and Sarah appeared at my door. They were holding an official-looking envelope. Their expressions were a carefully crafted blend of sorrow and resolve. They were playing the part of concerned children, making a difficult but necessary decision. "Mom, we have to talk," Mark said, not quite meeting my eyes. I invited them in and sat at my simple kitchen table, the same one where I'd frosted countless birthday cakes for him as a child. I gestured for them to sit. "This isn't easy for us," Sarah said, placing the envelope on the table between us. "This is a formal notice. We've started the proceedings to have you move to Golden Meadows, and we've had an offer on the apartment." She said it as if she were discussing the weather. I looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. I let the silence hang in the air, a heavy blanket of their making. I watched them. My son fidgeting with his expensive watch, his wife staring at me with pitying eyes. They saw a confused, frail old woman. They had no idea who they were talking to. Finally, I spoke, saying in a quiet, intense tone, "You're right. It is time for a change. But it's not me who will be moving." Mark let out an exasperated sigh. "Mom, don't be difficult. This is for your own good. We've handled everything." "Oh, I know you have," I said, my voice dangerously soft. I reached into the simple tote bag by my chair and pulled out my own file. I slid it across the table. It was a crisp, legally binding document. They stared at it, confused. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "The deed," I said, "to this building. I closed on it yesterday morning." The color drained from their faces in an instant. Mark's jaw went slack. Sarah's perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth. They stared at the paper, then at me, as if seeing me for the first time. The just a housewife was gone. The woman sitting before them was someone else entirely. "How?" Mark stammered. "That's not possible." "It is," I said, leaning forward, "when you're not spending your time committing wire fraud with an illegally used power of attorney." The mention of the crime hit them like a physical blow. They both paled even further. "I've purchased this building. And this," I said, pushing their envelope back towards them, "is irrelevant. However, I have a new notice for you." I slid a second document from my file. "This is a formal eviction notice for apartment 4B. For failure to pay rent, among other things, you have 30 days to vacate my property. I also have a full accounting of the loan you took out in my name. I expect that amount to be repaid in full. If not, this conversation will continue with the district attorney. Is that clear?" They sat there, frozen in utter, devastating silence. The hunter had become the prey. The house of cards they had built with their arrogance and deceit had just been blown away by the quiet breath of a woman they called dead weight. The 30 days that followed were a quiet storm. From my apartment, I heard the frantic, muffled sounds of their lives being packed into boxes. I saw movers in the hallway carrying away the sleek, modern furniture that had once seemed so intimidating. There were no more patronizing visits, no more forced smiles. There was only a thick, resentful silence. Mark passed me once on the stairs. He looked older, defeated. He couldn't bring himself to look me in the eye. In that moment, I felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sorrow for the son I had lost long before I bought the building.
They moved out on a gray, drizzly afternoon, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of their ambitions. My first act as the new owner was not one of revenge, but of restoration. I hired a reputable management company with strict instructions. The first order of business was to inspect every unit, to fix the leaky faucets and drafty windows that the previous owners had ignored for years. I met Mrs. Gable from 2C, an elderly widow like myself who was terrified her rent would skyrocket. I assured her it wouldn't. In fact, after reviewing the building's finances, I found room to lower it slightly for her. The relief in her eyes was more satisfying than any victory over my son. The second order of business was my own financial security. My lawyers drew up an airtight repayment plan for Mark and Sarah, garnished from the sale of their assets. It would take them years, but they would repay every single cent they had stolen. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about restoring the balance to the universe they had so arrogantly upended. I spent my days not just tracking stocks, but overseeing the small community I was now responsible for. I found a new purpose, not just as a trader, but as a caretaker. One sunny morning, months later, I was in my kitchen. The room was filled with the warm, sweet smell of cinnamon and sugar. I was baking a cake, not for an order, not for baking money, but for the pure joy of it. My hands caked with flour were steady once more. I looked out the window down at the street where life went on, oblivious to the small drama that had unfolded within these brick walls. They called me just a housewife, and in a way, they were right. I was still a woman who found solace in her home. The difference was, now the house was truly mine. I had learned that a person's worth isn't in the labels others give them, but in the power they quietly build for themselves. My strength wasn't just in my portfolio. It was in the resilience to withstand betrayal and the wisdom to turn a painful ending into a peaceful new beginning. And that was a victory sweeter than any cake I could ever bake